In this roundup of a week, across the world, countries are nervously taking the first steps to end coronavirus lockdown. Is it too soon? President Trump defunds the WHO and steps up attacks on China, and the first citizens panel on climate change comes back with surprisingly radical ideas. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for change makers. Welcome back to the unethical experimentation on human beings that is 2020. I hope you're doing as well as you could hope for. Among other things, President Trump this week announced that the worst was over and it would soon be time to reopen America. Then he released the US plan for ending lockdown, and in spite of the president's verbal style and what some people expected, by and large it was actually pretty restrained and focused on medical progress that needed to be seen before taking action. It raises an interesting question. How far will discipline hold as the US in particular gets closer to the point where people expect lockdown to end? Read any autobiography of someone who spent a period of time in prison, and you'll probably see a reference to how much more difficult is the time just before when you know your sentence is going to end, but when you're not quite there yet. This may well be the reason why, unlike a number of other countries, the UK has refused to speculate about the dates or the process for ending lockdown. Their view is that such discussions would be likely to distract people from the simplicity of the message to stay home. And as I predicted just a couple of weeks ago, we're already seeing signs that the US is the least temperamentally suited to put up with these sorts of measures for very long. Michigan saw protests this week from people, many pointedly ignoring social distancing strictures, demanding an end to the state's lockdown so that they could keep their jobs and stave off poverty. Many of the protesters bore the trappings of Trump supporters, and the governor of Michigan is a Democrat, Gretchen Whitmer. So the research I mentioned last week that people were less inclined to support measures where their political opponents were the ones that were imposing them was kind of borne out by that. It was sparked by Whitmer's extension of the state's lockdown, but also it being toughened up to prevent people travelling to second homes, closing areas of shops selling non-essential goods and that sort of thing. Not entirely surprisingly, given that Michigan has the third highest death rate among the states right now. So will the states hold together as there's more talk of the plan to end lockdown? Part of the challenge is that it's very easy to draw the boundaries on a complete lockdown. Stay at home. There. Easy. But as soon as you start getting gradations of actions, it becomes easier to ignore restrictions and harder for them to be enforced. The US plan establishes criteria that have to be met before the state can move towards the first phase. It has to have a downward trajectory of COVID-19 cases within a 14-day period. The state's hospitals need to be able to treat all patients without crisis care, and there has to be a robust testing program in place. If you have all that and you reach phase 1, you can start a gradual return to work while keeping social distancing in public and staying out of groups of more than 10 people. Vulnerable people have to stay locked up. Employers should continue to encourage working from home where possible. Schools stay closed, bars stay closed, non-essential travel is banned. Hospital and care homes should not allow visiting. Large venues like sports venues, places of worship, sit-down dining can open with suitable physical distancing rules. Phase 2 becomes possible if you've done phase 1 for a while and you haven't found a surge in cases. It means you can now engage in non-essential travel. Schools open, bars can open with diminished standing room facility. And phase 3, vulnerable people can emerge into public but keep their distance. For everyone else, it's sex, drugs and rock and roll. Well, except with a bit of social distancing. So just for drugs and the rock and roll, really. Honestly, I think once you get into phase 1, you're going to see informal bleeding over into stage 2 and stage 3 very quickly. You might say, but what about Sweden? Sweden's strictures are basically phase 2. And people have held to the discipline of those rules perfectly well. And by and large, that's true, but there's a couple of obvious things to say about that. First, Sweden is not America. Sweden is a high-tax, big state, high-trust in institutions country, which is rather different to a low-tax, high-individualism, low-trust in institutions country like the US. I'm not saying one is better than the other, by the way. They're just different. And so second, what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. Swedes have happily gone along with a more relaxed approach in spite of higher deaths, because the state said from day one it trusted them to behave sensibly. They appreciated being treated like adults. They appreciated being able to go out and have dinner with their friends. The US, like most other countries, has had a tight lockdown imposed. But in the US, that's been against the backdrop of political infighting amidst a presidential election campaign. People are not so united in the common effort as maybe they are in some other places. Of course, the impatience, that's not unique to America. Denmark, Germany, Spain, Italy and Austria have all seen some initial measures tentatively starting to relax their measures. They all say that they're ready to begin the journey because they're seeing a declining trend of new cases of COVID-19. Here's Denmark, Germany, Spain, Italy, Austria. I have to say, of all of those, you'd only really say that Austria looked like it's reached the declining point. The others clearly had gone over the initial hump, but seemed to have a stream of new cases that was staying stubbornly quite high. Here's the UK curve, similarly stable at high numbers, but currently determined not to talk about coming out of lockdown. Italy, Spain and Austria have allowed partial returns to work. In Italy, bookshops, laundries, stationers, children's clothes stores have opened. Full lockdown is scheduled to end on May the 4th. In Austria, parks, small shops, DIY and gardening stores are open. All stores will reopen on May the 2nd, with restaurants joining them mid-May. Denmark will open daycare centres and primary schools on April the 15th. Restaurants and the like may be opening on May the 10th. They're probably only too aware of the example of Hokkaido in Japan. It was an early success story of the initial virus outbreak, was traced and contained. Lots of successful, vigorous action taken, and by mid-March the numbers of new cases had dropped to 1 or 2 per day. On March the 19th, the state of emergency was lifted. But very quickly that led to a second surge, and the state of emergency had to be reimposed. That's got to be a relevant lesson, hasn't it? Because is there any reason at all why that shouldn't happen? If your country takes such vigorous and effective action that you eliminate it altogether from your country, well, great. As long as you can close your borders and require everyone to go in quarantine on the way in, and you're laughing. But none of the countries looking at relaxing their measures are in that position. What's the rationale that says that opening up, albeit slowly, is going to be better than it was at the beginning when the virus first arrived? Isn't this all about allowing the virus to work its way through the population, but at a slower, more manageable pace? And up until that point where you reach herd immunity, assuming that's even possible, because it depends on people not being able to catch the virus twice, and there's mixed evidence for that. You might say, but what about China? They took action and they've opened up and they haven't had a second wave, or at least as far as we can tell. Bearing in mind we don't know the whole story in China because we can't trust all the information, but it must be true up to a point. Maybe that's the happy upside of living under a communist dictatorship. They can lock down so effectively, they can properly eliminate pandemics. Of course, they can also shoot hundreds of protesting students and pull people from the fields to make steel for the glory of a nation, resulting in famine and the deaths of 40 million people, and keep Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, which you might suggest is the downside of the communist dictatorships, just in case we should be too impressed by the upside. Nevertheless, it doesn't seem wise to imagine that whatever was the factor that worked in Wuhan is going to be able to be repeated in Europe or in America. So if controllable progress to herd immunity is ultimately where we're going to end up, you might well argue that Sweden, with its more relaxed approach, has had the right idea all along. Yes, it's had 139 deaths per million compared to its Nordic neighbours who have been locked down, such as 58 for Denmark, 29 for Norway, just 14 for Finland. But if they're going to end up catching them up in the long run, then the main difference between them will have been the amount of damage done by each to their own economy on the way, and the knock-on effect that may have over the coming years. And that's something we won't really know about the true costs of until much, much later. In the meantime, such uncertainties mean that debates have continued to rage, with sceptics arguing the lockdown has been over the top and others attacking their government for not acting more quickly. One case that the sceptics were making has lost a bit of its force this week. Some were suggesting in the UK that all the coronavirus was doing was moving people who mostly would have died anyway from one ward to an ICU ward, and that this was reflected in the fact that death rates overall haven't been above the standard average death rates for the time of year. And that had actually been the case in the early stages, but recent figures show that that's decidedly no longer the case in the UK. And I showed figures last week which showed it hadn't been the case already for Italy and for Spain. Strangely enough, climate skeptics have often entered the debate here as coronavirus lockdown skeptics. Climate change advocates have often entered the debate as critics of slow government response to the initial warnings. It seems to have been an obvious evolution by all accounts. The one exception is that I read somewhere a few weeks ago that the only critics at that time of Sweden's more relaxed policy had indeed been climate skeptics. I haven't been able to find out who they were referring to. If it's true, it would be tempting to suggest this indicates a basic contrarian mindset regardless of the orthodoxy. Maybe if the orthodoxy was that climate change is rubbish, it means that those same skeptics would be lining up to defend it, which would be a fascinating alternative universe. But you can't generalise based on random small exceptions when you don't even know the identities of who they're talking about. In any case, the way that mainstream media continues to talk about the crisis makes things more confusing. For instance, if you ask most people which country in the world has been the worst hit, most people will say the United States, because it has the highest death toll, the highest daily death figures. But it makes no sense, because surely the meaningful figure isn't the overall number of deaths, but as I said for Sweden, deaths per capita. On that score, the US has quite a low rate. It suffered 105 deaths per million compared to Spain at 413 deaths per million. And Italy's 367. But in actual fact, the country that has been the worst hit, the absolute worst performer at the time of shooting this video was, wait for it, Belgium. Have you heard a lot of talk about Belgium? No, me neither. But on a per capita basis, they have had more deaths at 419 per million. They are well behind some of the others in absolute terms because their population's a lot smaller. The UK has had 202 deaths per million, so some way behind the leaders at the moment, but showing higher daily deaths, so catching up slowly. Of course, if you separated out the US states and counted them as countries, then the worst performer by far is New York with a horrifying 821. Although, as I said last week, we have to treat all of these figures with suspicion because there's junk data flying around all over the place. People are measuring things differently, lots of stuff's getting added in days, even weeks after the event. It's a mess. And that junk is probably inflating New York's figure since a bunch of people are allegedly being added to the tally without having been tested for coronavirus. Well, look, here's my take. Lessons for the future. The countries that have done the best on this were those that acted quickly to shut down or otherwise control people coming into the country and to test and trace every possible contact in a very concentrated and focused way. The World Health Organization's line that countries shouldn't restrict travel is out-and-out politics, not helpful advice. If you're not going to do that early movement and rapid action thing, and there's lots of reasons why countries might choose not to do that, then the Sweden approach has a lot to commend it. If, and it's an important if, you have a disease where once it's running free, it's basically going to run its course until the population develops herd immunity. Sweden adopted some sensible restrictions because you don't want your health system being overwhelmed because more people would then die than otherwise would have, but otherwise they minimise the disruption to the community and to the economy. Obviously, it depends on the virus, which of the two approaches you take. And you don't always have perfect information when you have to make the decision, which is why having the World Health Organization telling people that they shouldn't be closing their borders and it wasn't so bad really was a contributory factor to how badly this went. And that's remained topical because this week President Trump, to the dismay of many, including the other members of the G7 and also Bill Gates, defunded the WHO, saying that it had been too pro-China. Various people pointed out that the middle of a pandemic is not the time you should be pulling the rug from under your global organisation set up to deal with pandemics, even if they did, and some dispute that they did, but even if they did make some grievous errors early on. Personally, I think that's probably true. The WHO may not make that much difference to what the Europeans and Americans do, because they're all pretty much leading the action for their own countries. But in terms of coordinating, resourcing and caring about how this plays across developing countries, I would expect that the World Health Organization has a pretty key role. And this is where the US has to take some real care, because it's just another area now where they seem to be retreating from the role of world leadership that they've had pretty solidly since the end of the Second World War. Reacting against China while leaving a vacuum for China to fill, it's not an obviously smart strategy, or if it is, it's too subtle for the likes of me. China is continuing to build its military, including possibly, it's alleged, preparations for renewed nuclear testing. China is continuing to build its technical capabilities, and now it's delighting in taking an international lead, for instance sending needed PPE to New York when Trump had turned them down. Okay, some of what they sent was junk. It's still a communist dictatorship, remember. Quality control has never been communism's strength. But don't imagine it can't change. And in the short term, you can see a number of people stepping up in preparation for the blame game that will dominate the next few months. It'll come first and foremost because it's an election year. And before all else, Trump doesn't want the American people to blame him. So we're told that the US administration are furious with China because they robbed America of the best economy they'd had for decades. The economy already had certain elements of fragility, to be fair. The Trump campaign were desperately hoping it would hold together so he'd be able to run on a don't mess it up now type campaign, which is the privilege of a second term election for a president with a strong economy. In some ways, this may actually turn out to be better for him. We had the strong economy, you saw it, but then it was taken away by this external other, and they are to blame. That's probably Trump's best campaign pitch, and unless Biden proves to be more effective than he's been so far, could well work well for him. But don't imagine this is just Trump. The UK, in somewhat more diplomatic language, has nevertheless said that there were some hard questions for China to answer once things had calmed down. That line was mirrored by President Macron of France. This may be simply because they're all getting intelligence that what happened in China isn't exactly what we've been told, because that's highly likely. It's a communist dictatorship. Did I mention that? And then France has had terrible deaths. The UK is awful. All of these governments won't have missed the benefit of having an external other to take some heat off them. There's also anger at China in Africa. China's steady progress to become a world power has partially been a work in progress in Africa. Chinese companies have invested there where others thought it was too risky or too difficult to do so on an ethical basis with the local corruption that's there. But in the wake of the virus, Africans in China have found themselves the target of some fairly vicious discrimination by the local population who have seen them as carriers of the disease and a risk. It's not unique. There are a number of places where people have reacted against foreigners who have been seen as bringing the virus into the country. But for Africa to be so institutionally angry as they are with China is quite a significant thing. It probably doesn't wholly derail the Chinese plans for African investment in the future, but it is a challenge to their global ambition. There's a lot more to come on the blame theme, and I expect I'll be doing something specifically on that in the not too distant future. Not that I think blame is very helpful. Where a virus originates from, useful to know, not useful to attach blame. How individual leaders handle it, unless they do something egregiously awful, useful to learn from, not useful to attach blame. I'm not much interested in nailing who's to blame, unless it turns out something way more nefarious than we thought was going on. However, how the blame game plays out is going to be decisive in how we do or don't learn lessons for the future, which is the important thing. And on the basis of that, which leaders and governments do or don't get to survive this challenging period and remain in power in the future. In the meantime, life does still go on, even though half the population are working from home in their pyjamas, and that means, you guessed it, more is happening on climate change. In the heat of the Gilets jaunes protest in France, President Macron set up a panel, a citizens' assembly in fact, on climate change. As you know, in the UK, Extinction Rebellion has called for a citizens' assembly on climate change that would be different to any we'd seen in the past, in that the UK Parliament would be subservient to it. It would have to take action on whatever it came up with. I've argued against that many times here, because even if you agree that there should be robust action on climate change, there's no case for using that in order to abandon democratic accountability. However, the French are not so finicky. After all, when the people revolt in France, people have been known to lose their heads, literally. So in the face of the protests, Macron set up a 150-strong citizen panel to come up with proposals on climate change. And it wasn't only advisory. He committed that the things that they came up with would either be done straight away, or put before Parliament in legislation, or put to the people in a referendum. None of the proposals could just be dismissed. The principle of that should have gladdened the heart of people like Rupert Read of Extinction Rebellion, and particularly because they've now come back after their deliberations and they actually had some quite radical proposals. Certainly more radical than I would have expected. But then, as I've said, partly it comes down to how genuinely random the selection is. Large numbers of people were approached to join this panel, around 250,000. Most people said no. So even if they're selected to be demographically diverse, there's a certain self-selecting element in there. And it also comes down to who briefs and informs the panel and what they're given as a brief. Macron told them to come up with ways to help France cut emissions by 40% by 2030. Anyway, here are some of the things they came back with. Prohibit the sale of cars that emit more than 110 grams of CO2 per kilometre by 2025, which is far below that which is emitted by most existing cars, so it's a near-term ban on standard cars. Close out-of-town hypermarkets to encourage shopping locally. Cancel the rollout of the 5G network, not because 5G does any of the nefarious things people suggest, but because it uses 30% more electricity. Ban advertising hoardings to prevent consumers from driving long distances to buy products they don't need. And also ban advertising for any products that produce a lot of CO2. So now, at this precise point in the coronavirus calendar, President Macron has given himself a dilemma. He probably wouldn't want to do most of those things on a good day. And we're a long way away from any good days. So, is he going to break his promise? Is he going to put them into legislation for Parliament, knowing that when the measures get submitted to proper scrutiny, they'll be thrown out and the backlash might then be even worse? Or will he put them to the population in a referendum, knowing that if they throw them out, it'll be bulletproof? There's always the chance that some things might randomly get passed, in which case then there'll be no stopping them. And for me, this is why you don't hand over your democracy to a panel like this. If you look at the technical report of the UK Committee on Climate Change, they look systematically at the various aspects that need to be changed, assessed the options, informed by experts, calculated the processes by which you might be able to move things forward by keeping society up and running. Alternatively, a panel like this comes up with a few bright ideas. They may have a real downside, the consequences of which the panel may not be fully aware of or may not particularly care about, because it's not them that feel the consequences. And they don't add up to effective action to solve the problem. Things like banning advertising is often what campaigners come up with. Doesn't mean that such bans are actually effective and would make any difference. I can't imagine the French experience here is going to inspire anyone else to think that giving away your power to random citizens is the way to go. I could be wrong. Just time for one thing that I like and one thing that I don't. Thing that I like, I'm nearly all the way through the non-fiction book Wild Swans. It's a biography of 3 generations of women who grew up and had completely different lives through the period in China of the Japanese occupation up to the Second World War, the Communist Revolution, and then Mao's China through the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and so on. It's a series of hugely powerful human stories, great way to see one aspect of that history and to understand how those events impacted on ordinary people. And if you want to understand why the China of today is the way that it is, it's a really interesting perspective on all of that. Highly recommended. And then the thing that I don't like, well, look, we're seeing a roll call of people that have died because of the virus. Every single one is a tragedy. Nevertheless, I was particularly saddened this week by the death of Tim Brooke Taylor. He was a British comedian who was part of my childhood growing up. The Goodies was one of my favourite programmes. He's done various things since that I've loved. By all accounts, he was a great person, and it's just a real shame he's been taken years before he would have gone. So just remember, this virus doesn't care how good a person you are. Keep out of the way of it this week if it's within your power. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.